This Blessed Union by T-Drop. Narrated by Michael Hagiantonis. Leo somehow passed the time until dinner in his room without going wild, distracting himself with books, music, pacing, anything he could. The second it was close enough to prepare for dinner, he dressed in his fine clothes, slipped into shoes, and tried to comb his curly hair into some semblance of order. When he had stared at his own visage in the tall mirror long enough, thinking he looked too short and too small to be intimidating before his king, he sighed and left his room. While the hours waiting for dinner time had seemed to crawl by, the trip to the dining room seemed much shorter than usual, even though he walked slowly. The villa was large, but not so sprawling that it took a long time to walk the length of it. Yet, it felt like merely a few seconds between Leo leaving his room and finding himself outside the dining room doors. He took a quiet, deep inhale, and then went through. The dining room was an airy space, with giant arched windows facing the ocean, draped in gauzy curtains that let in as much light as possible. The sun was low on the horizon, but not quite beginning to set, and from the large dining table one could witness the beauty of the watery and sandy landscape. A chandelier of crystal beads hung in the centre of the ceiling, and the sun always glinted off it in a host of colours, regardless of the time of day. The dining table was currently laid out with a fine dinner that it usually only saw once a month, or when they entertained Shay's business partners. Leo usually loved eating in here under any circumstances, but even the lovely view and atmosphere would do nothing to cheer him up this evening. As he entered, his gaze fixed at once on the man sitting at the head of the table, in Isaac's usual spot. He was of average height and build, with dark hair and blue eyes. He was not adorned in jewels or anything overtly kingly, aside from his signet ring. Something in the way he held himself, and his proud expression, was enough to showcase his superiority. Even where he'd seated himself spoke volumes without him having to say a word. Isaac looked out of place, sitting at his right side. Leo walked close enough to the table to be polite, before giving a stiff, ceremonial bow. "Your Highness," he said, in an attempt at sincerity. The king gave a small dip of his head in response.
"Leonardo, thank you for joining us. Please, sit."
King or not, Leo felt his pride bristle at being welcomed to his own table as though he were the guest. Isaac looked none too pleased either, and that was what gave Leo the resolve to be as quiet and calm as possible. Isaac losing his temper was the last outcome Leo wished for. He went to take his seat at the table, to the king's left and across from Isaac. It was uncomfortable almost immediately, as he became aware of the king openly studying him.
"You've grown since I last saw you," he commented. "My brother-in-law, it seems, has not been starving you."
Leo did not answer. He almost felt sick already. Admirably, Isaac took up the conversation for him. "He could benefit from a few extra pounds, if anything, but he swims too much to hold any weight."
"The oceanside life still suits you, then?"
the king asked, and Leo nodded in agreement. "If he was any more suited to it, he'd have formed gills by now," Isaac said, genuinely trying for Leo's sake. It tugged a very small, thankful grin from Leo's lips. The king gave a civil smile as well, and they all began to eat. Leo couldn't taste anything properly. Everything he swallowed felt like it hit his nervous stomach and began bouncing about inside him. He didn't eat much, instead focusing on his drinks. The water, tea, and fresh fruit juice were at least calming somewhat. This was all ceremony. The king was not here on a pleasant visit. He had business with them, and was only waiting until after they'd shared a meal to address it. In the meantime, Isaac carried on a conversation about the quality and success of the regional agriculture. Their entire country of Aldonia was famously fertile, but this particular area by the ocean was especially rich and productive. Leo was proud of his people, this place where he'd been raised, and liked hearing Isaac speak about it all, even if his tone and bearing was so stiff and dry. Shay was much better at playing happy host, but Isaac was at least doing the bare minimum acceptably. The king, meanwhile, made his own small talk about enjoying travelling here to the warmer region. At the heart of Aldonia, where he lived in the capital, it was beginning to snow. A few more questions were directed at Leo, and he answered in as few words as possible without appearing rude. The king did not seem overly concerned about his standoffish behaviour. Leo was both relieved and wound tighter than ever once they'd finished their dessert course, and it was obvious that they could have the real discussion the king had come here for. A mutual silence came over them as the servants took their plates away, leaving them with only their glasses. Once they all withdrew, the king cleared his throat.
Well, Isaac, that was a lovely dinner. I appreciate you preparing for me on such short notice.
Not at all, Isaac said, the tension in his voice thinly disguised, though I may ask what your purpose was in coming here. The business was set in motion. Leo's spine felt like it might snap with how taut he suddenly held himself.
I will be frank,
the king said, sitting up straighter and fixing his eyes on Leo.
I have need of you, Leonardo. As I predicted, you may serve Aldonia greatly in the coming days.
The back of Leo's neck prickled, and he took in a small breath. He'd known. From the second he'd seen the seal on that letter, he'd known. You're taking me away, aren't you? Leo asked bluntly, voice flat. The king sighed lightly.
Do let me explain before jumping to conclusions. King Theo, I believe I warned you about this very situation when last you entered my home.
Isaac's tone was low and tense, his eyes hard. The king did not even blink.
I am kind enough to forgive your insolence, Isaac, he said, coolly, but would remind you of where you stand, and whose Leonardo is.
Why do you need me? Leo asked, before Isaac had a chance to rebuff again. Theo turned those blue eyes on him while he answered.
To condense years of political negotiation and counsel into a few words, we are renegotiating our treaty with Spa. It'll be the culmination of every effort we've made to keep the peace between our borders and, hopefully, the final push to establishing camaraderie for future generations.
Every Aldonian southerner was aware of the ongoing struggle to maintain peace with the Sparian northerners. Their two countries had been involved in the longest recorded battle over a major trade route, nearly 50 years of conflict between their peoples. It had only been ended a few years before Leo's birth, and then only because the route was declared neutral territory. An actual peace treaty had not been signed until over 15 years later. It was at that time that King Theo had made his first appearance in Leo's life. How does Leo factor into any of that? Isaac demanded. Theo narrowed his eyes a bit at Isaac's tone, annoyance showing on his face.
The Sparian king has been on a path of reform since ascending the throne. Amongst his efforts, he has been reassessing the peace treaty that I signed with his father. He wants to negotiate more airtight terms, seal it in writing once more, and place our current peace front and center in the public eye. Especially considering the advancements in technology and magic, we need to both impress upon our peoples the importance of using such knowledge to improve our everyday lives, not to further machines of conflict.
With all due respect, my lord, Isaac said, make your point.
I was coming to that. You're such an impatient man. The king sighed. Both the Northern King's advisers and my own suggested that an offer of good faith be made from either side, to show our honourable intentions to remain peaceful. We debated long in the Parliament, before agreeing on a suitable symbol of our sincerity. King Theor turned his head deliberately to look at Leo, and the young man frowned back. I can think of nothing that would communicate that intention clearer than the hand of my firstborn in marriage to the Sparian king. For a second, Theor's words registered as nonsense. Leo simply couldn't make sense of them. It was like his self-preservation had deafened him to the meaning behind that statement. The next second, it all struck him at once, and his mouth dropped open in disbelief. You jest. His voice came out quiet and shocked. Leo had suspected King Theor would be trying to pry him away from his home, but he never anticipated anything like this. I assure you, I am quite serious, Theor said. The entire matter is of the utmost importance, and you are the key to its success. Leo's gaze flew at once to Isaac, who looked just as stunned as he did. The king went on. I understand that this may come as a shock. It has been 6 long years since I hinted that I might need to maneuver you out of this refuge and into the political field. That time has come to pass.
That's nonsense, Leo sputtered. I'm not a worthy offering in anyone's eyes. You've made that quite clear for the entire country and bordering countries to see. Theor took in a small breath and let it out shortly, as though cleansing his convictions before speaking.
That may have been the case before, but times change. The actuality is, Leonardo, that no treasure in the royal coffers could ever compare to my blood heir. Though you've lived apart from your position, you are the firstborn prince of Aldonia. You are the highest value gift we have, and your hand in marriage would be undeniable proof of our earnestness.
How dare you!
Leo flinched as Isaac lashed out loudly, slamming his hands down on the table, rattling all their drink glasses. King Theor jumped a bit too, but composed himself at once while Isaac steamed, face red with anger.
You disagree with Leonardo's value?
Theor asked, unruffled. I disagree with your bold-faced lies, my lord, insisted Isaac, fearless even while addressing his king. Where was Leo's value when you threw him away a mere week after his birth? How highly did you regard him when you denounced your own son and publicly abandoned him?
Not remaining in contact with you may have been an oversight, admitted King Theor, looking at Leo. Had I allowed you to know the truth from your childhood, perhaps you and your guardians would not be so hostile and disloyal.
Leo felt himself actually sneer with revulsion, to which the king shook his head as though he were disappointed.
The truth of the matter is, it was reckless of me to denounce you entirely. However, part of me always knew you'd make an excellent bargaining chip in future endeavours, should I need you. Once your mother, rest her soul, did not provide me additional heirs, I reassessed your worth and found it to be immeasurable.
You have no right to say that, Isaac fumed tightly through his teeth. To Shay and I, he's truly priceless. We're the ones who watched him grow up, kept him safe, and poured our lives into him. We love and understand him. You left your parental rights at the door when you threw him away.
I returned to address my mistakes, King Theor said, still eerily calm in the face of his brother-in-law's accusations. I attempted to make right my missteps, did I not, Leonardo?
When I was 16, Leo answered coldly, words coming to him that he hadn't intended on speaking. You'd waited too long to win me over like I was a child, your highness. I was no fool then, and I'm no fool now. I've been your hidden pawn all this time, rather than a son you care at all for, and now you've simply found a way to use me. I wouldn't call that making anything right so much as taking advantage of my mere existence."
"He's correct," Isaac said proudly. "He's of age now, and you cannot dictate his mind or his actions."
The king did not answer their scathing words for a moment, just took a bite of his fruit and chewed thoughtfully. Then he turned toward Leo and said,
"Your uncle speaks true. I cannot endear you to me or my policies, but in this regard, you have a duty to at least consider it."
"I have never been held to royal standard," Leo retorted quietly. "Not once I have been required to do so much as walk in a parade. How can you demand I give my entire future up on principles that I have never been expected to uphold?" King Theor gave a dismissive gesture with his hand.
"You'd have been wasted being flaunted about for such menial purposes. This is entirely different, and is of significantly more importance than anything I'd intended."
"Do you intend to force him into this marriage?" Isaac asked sharply, having lost what scrap of patience he'd had. "Will you have your guards haul him away when he refuses?"
"Do not be so absurd," the king nearly laughed. "Of course Leonardo has a choice. There have been no arranged marriages in our bloodline for almost a century, but even back then there were rules set into place. Whatever Leonardo's stance, he must accompany me to visit the other intended party in Spa and state his intentions for himself before witnesses."
"Can't I simply tell you I refuse here and now?" Leo asked, tersely, "and you share my response with the Sparian king or his advisors?"
"It is not enough to convey an intended party's word on trust," Theo explained. "Treachery has occurred in the past. If someone other than the intended party is opposed to the arrangement and tries to sabotage it through miscommunication. Therefore, both intended parties must meet with their advisors and explain in person whether they accept or refuse. From there, either negotiations will be attempted or the union planning will proceed."
There was a brief moment of silence as Leo and Isaac tried to swallow the intrusiveness of it all, and by what authority they were bound to respect. Leo surprised himself by being the one to speak next. "When must we leave?" he asked, resignedly.
"We shouldn't have to," Isaac fired up at once. "This entire situation is preposterous. My lord, I invoke my right to object."
"I assumed you would,"
King Theor said, the sudden tightness of his smile the first blatant sign of his irritation.
"But I'm afraid, since Leonardo came of age, all decisions regarding his future are up to him, as you stated yourself. Frankly put, Isaac, any custody rights you had were nullified 2 years ago."
"I'll battle you straight then,"
Isaac insisted, his knuckles popping as he clenched his hands. "In Parliament." "Isaac," Leo said gently. His uncle looked at him furiously.
"Don't speak to me in that tone, Leo," he shot back. "I told you that I wouldn't let this happen, and I'm following through on that promise."
"It would be very unwise for you to pursue this course," the king warned. "You may be royalty as well, but legally, you have no case. Leonardo is a man. The decision is his. He is also bound by duty to at the very least make the journey."
"It's true," Leo said, feeling like a traitor as he saw Isaac's face twist up at his words. "Isaac, I don't want your name or reputation to suffer from a pointless legal battle. It could bankrupt you as well. Please. If we have to go in person to refuse, that is what we will do." The king broke his calm demeanour to look the tiniest bit smug, raising a haughty eyebrow at his brother-in-law.
"He is far more level-tempered than you, Isaac. It's clearly in his blood."
Isaac shot up from his chair so quickly that it clattered back a few inches, and just barely managing to stay upright. The 4 guards that had been stationed silently in the room responded to his movement stepping forward in trained formation, hands on their stunners. "Isaac!" Leo cried, slightly panicked. "Please, it's all right, just sit down."
"Or better yet," suggested King Theor, "leave the room. I'd like a word with my son alone, without your interference."
As livid as Isaac looked, he eyed the guards warily and backed down. When he looked at Leo, the young man nodded at him pleadingly. Isaac then gave a sharp exhale and was escorted from the dining room. When the doors closed behind him and the guards took their places once more, King Theor leaned back in his chair and gave a small sigh. His entire being seemed to relax now that the other man was gone. Leo, on the other hand, was extremely nervous. He had never been left alone with his father before. But King Theor seemed more concerned with topping off his wine than how Leo felt at the moment.
"That man is determined to give himself problems,"
he said, almost under his breath.
"Had I known that Shay was absent, I might have timed my trip better. Although, there was limited time for it regardless, considering how soon we must journey to Spa."
"Do I really have any authority to reject this marriage?" Leo asked, wanting to shift the conversation away from his uncle. "If I go with you and officially refuse, will my decision be honoured, or do you have the power to force me into it?" The king looked thoughtful for a few seconds.
"The Declarations of Intent mandate was created by our parliament specifically to keep the ruling authorities from abusing their power over their own offspring. It is relevant from the king down to the lowest commoner, and I believe it is the reason that arranged marriages have fallen out of fashion."
Leo sounded bitter when he responded. "Gods forbid a son or daughter have their own autonomy without their parents using them as they see fit. But none of us can choose our bloodlines. That is something I've had to settle with over the last 6 years. So answer my question. Can you, or can you not, force me to do this, merely by way of being my father and my king?"
"Please,"
the king scoffed.
"Even if I were not bound to uphold the Declarations of Intent, I have no need to use any means to persuade you, other than your status and your own conscience."
An uncomfortable feeling settled at the back of Leo's neck, and he frowned in confusion. Why would my own conscience play any part in this? King Theor fixed his blue eyes on Leo's for a moment, and Leo felt a small shudder roll up his spine when he realized how much they were like his own in some respects. He also knew what else that gaze was searching for.
"You know that the Northern King is a Faeblood, do you not?"
The question made that uncomfortable feeling begin to writhe suddenly against his skin, and he felt his brow roll back slightly. "I believe I've seen impressions of him before," Leo said, searching his memory. "He has fangs, if I recall. What Fae is in his ancestry?"
"Troll, if you believe his late father, the previous Sparian king, bragged about it profusely."
That seemed to prod some very tender area in Leo's heart that instantly bled out through his words. They came, tight and straightforward from his lips. "His father did not abandon him at birth, then, as you did me." Theor surprised Leo by looking away from him, then gazing out the tall windows to the brilliant sunset over the ocean. It was another few seconds before he answered, in a more quiet tone.
"I can't expect you to understand my reasoning, Leonardo.
It was a different time. We have advanced our mechanical and magical integration so far in such a short span of years that it is like looking back into a dark void where we knew nothing. Those advancements extend to the sharing of information. When you were born, none of my advisors or physicians had even heard of Faeblood." A cynical sound was ripped from Leo's throat, and he shook his head in disbelief. He could feel his limbs shaking very gently with his mounting anger and tension. "Do you expect me to view you as a victim in all this?" he demanded, his voice growing heated. "You publicly declared that I was a cursed child and handed me off to the nearest relative who would take me."
Superstitions are still deeply ingrained in our culture, Leonardo.
King Theo cleared his throat pointedly.
Special traits were unlike anything we'd seen in our lineage before. At the time, a curse was a reasonable explanation, and a cursed child in the royal family strikes fear into the common folk. Or at least, it did. Now is the time to even more strongly affirm your status and mend both our neighbours' and our own broken faith. And it is for that reason that I know you will not refuse this opportunity to effect change, in a way that you never could, tucked away in this villa for the rest of your life.
Leo's eyebrows lifted very slowly as he realized what his father was saying. He couldn't decide if that revelation made him feel better or not. For a very long time, he stared at the beaded water on the outside of his drinking glasses, trying to decide how he felt about the small part of him that agreed with the king almost instantly. "Every person with a heart wishes to make the world better," Leo finally said. "I'll admit that you have the right of it. I would be glad to play a part in the healing of our countries and perhaps much more. However," Leo hesitated, feeling terribly outclassed and remembering all the times Shay had tried to teach him how to negotiate best in his favour. "Say I refuse this marriage, and it truly is as simple as you claim. What then?"
"How do you mean?"
the king asked. "I'm assuming there will be news of this proposed marriage, or at the very least, of our trip to the northern kingdom of Spa. You cannot hope to hide it, and in acknowledging either one, you'll be handing me back my royal status, officially."
"I did that when you were 16.
King Theo rebuffed. "That wasn't enough," Leo pointed out firmly. "You came here in person, in secret, to tell me. Then you were bound to report it in the records, but made no announcement. The scribes may have whispered that I was taken back into the fold, but the common folk can easily brush that news off as nothing but royal rumours. It's not as if you took me to the capital city and made a public speech renouncing your actions. For this arrangement to go forward, you'll have to." The king's eyes narrowed at Leo, and a small smile that almost seemed proud came over his face.
"You're no dimwit, are you, Leonardo?" he asked, with a touch of levity. "You are correct that I'll have to address the issue directly."
"Before or after I've made my refusal known?" The smile vanished from Theo's face.
"Pardon?"
"Say you make the announcement on our way to Spa," Leo proposed, feeling a bit more assured in himself at the way he'd affected his father. "That I would technically have all the advantages of the prince that I legally am, whether I refuse or accept the proposal in the end." The king didn't answer with anything other than a tight nod that seemed to pain him. "But if you do not make the nature of your visit public knowledge, and I refuse, you can just whisk me back here like it never happened. What kind of influence would I have then, Your Highness?" Theo seemed torn between being impressed or annoyed.
"That merchant husband of Isaac's has taught you the art of shrewdness."
He washed his words down with a swallow of wine before speaking again.
"I see there is no fooling you, so I'll lay it out flat. If you accept the proposal, you shall not only unite our two battle-scarred kingdoms, but ensure that Faeblood are looked upon more kindly for the act."
When Leo looked suspicious of that, the king lifted his brows light-heartedly and said,
"Just think on it. The marriage of a Faeblood prince to a Faeblood king being the act that breaks the cycle of war and prejudice between their countries. There is a sort of poetry to it, isn't there?"
A small wave of revulsion made Leo snort. If we are nothing more than pieces on a playing board, I could see how that little story sounds inspiring. But we are both of us people. How does the Northern King feel about this proposal? As a young king, does he not have romantic interests or a royal courtship already?
He had been courted Princess Salora and Prince Fiori from the Western Kingdom a few years back, but nothing came of either attempt. Beyond that, there had been no efforts made to find him a bride.
Through our communications with Spa's ambassadors, it is confirmed that King Reinhairs is officially unattached.
Whether that means that he is receptive to the proposal, we'll have to find out on our visit.
Leo's mind pulled up vague images of King Reinhairs at his coronation more than a decade prior.
The impressions captured of the event had been front and center in every news avenue. He wasn't the youngest prince to inherit a throne, but he was still young enough that it caused a buzz.
Over the years, Leo had seen other headlines pop up about King Reinhairs bettering the lives of all of his citizens by investing heavily in the study and advancement of magic, technology, and science.
His father before him had begun the movement,
but it was Klaus von Reinhairs who was fine-tuning the true application of such progress. Beyond the numerous articles that Leo had skimmed beneath King Reinhairs' name, the one feature he could never forget was his fangs.
The Sparians certainly had an intimidating man leading their country, a Faeblood of troll descent. It did indeed seem poetic that Aldonia had also produced a Faeblood prince as well.
What about you, Leonardo?
King Theor interrupted Leo's silent contemplation.
Do you currently have any romantic interests that may cause complications for your decision?
Leo was half tempted to lie just to spite him, but he realized quickly that the effort would be wasted. So he answered honestly. Not for many years now. A strange look came over the king's face, and the way he studied Leo became slightly disdainful.
I can imagine that finding any romantic companionship must have been difficult for you, considering.
He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't have the chance. The pain that struck Leo was so vast, so deeply rooted in personal struggles that had never been fully resolved, that he broke at those words. He pounded his fist on the table, just once, the side of his closed hand landing loudly and planting firm. Unlike how Isaac had struck out with both palms, Leo's motion was a deliberate warning, rather than an infuriated reaction. His voice wavered, but was insistent as he said, "You know nothing of me in my personal regard. Therefore, on this most private of topics, assume nothing, think nothing, and most importantly," Leo turned a rawly threatening expression on his father, "say nothing." Leo half expected King Theor to brush off his words, as he had nearly everything else tonight. But to Leo's surprise, the man sobered, lowering his gaze to give a silent nod of agreement. A savage sort of pride welled up in Leo's chest, though it was wounded by the emotional turmoil residing there as well. He'd lost control for a second, just as Isaac had, and he was disappointed in himself for that. Leo loved Isaac dearly, as an adopted father, but he'd never wanted to model his own temper after his example. Instead, he'd always tried to be more like Shay when it came to being calm and rational under pressure. With shaking hands, Leo poured himself a glass of wine and downed half of it in one go, begging it to settle his nerves. It was only after he placed the glass down again that Theor spoke, his tone colder and more distant than he had allowed it to be before.
"Both you and King Reinhairs being unattached makes even the prospect of this union easier.
Royal messages have already been sent by both our kingdoms, and our initial proposal for talk of an arranged marriage has been accepted. Once the declaration of intent portion of the proceedings is in the Northern Kingdom, you shall have your opportunity to speak your mind. Not even I can deny you that right."
Something about the king's delivery made Leo wary to the point where his skin crawled, sensing a condition just dangling out of his reach. Theo held it tauntingly out of sight for a small span of silence, before dropping it clearly before Leo. "However, should you refuse, I will make no further efforts to legitimize your relation to me or the royal family." For a moment, Leo was confused, feeling that the threat lacked any true weight. He felt small and slow-minded until the king went on.
"Spar has their champion for Faeblood in their very own king. Aldonia, however, could still use such an icon. If the Faeblood in question were in a high enough position to influence the masses."
Then it all clicked into place. In one dreadful second, Leo understood both the vast positive impact he might have with his royal status, and also what a waste it might be to lose it forever. The shock and confliction that washed over Leo was so strong, there was no possibility of hiding it. For several heartbeats, his wide eyes stared, his mouth draped open, and his brows crowded down in horror. Gradually, all expression drained from his face, as he felt himself grow too overwhelmed and numb to think any more. His voice came out just as emotionless. "I understand. Thank you for being upfront and honest about your manipulation. I'll retire to my room now." Leo stood up, very aware that it was proper to wait for the king to rise first. Theo did not call him out of the disrespect, but remained seated.
"Before I bid you good night, I'll answer your earlier question, Leonardo," he said. "We shall leave in 2 days. My airship is moored to the local docks. Once we arrive in Spar, there will be proceedings for a few days before the sit-down negotiations. Pack whatever you'd like, but I'd advise you to wait and purchase new articles of clothing once we reach the capital. It will be bitterly cold there." It was with much scorn that Leo turned towards his father and gave a short bow before leaving the table and heading for the nearest door without a word. "Good night then, Leonardo," the king called deliberately. Leo could not bring himself to answer, but slipped out the door, with only his dignity keeping him from slamming it shut behind him.